I'm with Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad, India's former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, twice over. The first time from 2000 to 2003, and the second from 2010 to 2011. And India's ambassador, former ambassador to the UAE from 1999 to 2003, following which Ambassador Singh went from the UAE to Tehran, Iran, where he was ambassador of India from 2003 to 2005. And the reason I have both these gentlemen amongst India's best diplomats and experts on the Gulf and the Middle East is because we are discussing this path-breaking deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, brokered by China in Beijing on Friday, the 10th of March. But first of all, before I get ahead of myself, let me welcome you both to The Print. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
So thank you both. Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad, you were in Saudi Arabia these twice over, and as was Ambassador Singh in Iran. But let me ask you, Ambassador Ahmad, this meeting between the National Security Advisor of Saudi Arabia and his Iranian counterpart in Beijing, what does it mean to you?
I think this is a very significant encounter. It follows earlier engagements between China and these two countries. President Xi Jinping had visited Riyadh 3 months ago, and the Iranian President Raisi had visited Beijing last month. So there has been something happening behind the scenes. What we need to focus on is the effort that has been made by China to bring these two parties together. Just a few months ago, you will recall that in the United States, there were reports that Saudis had complained to the Americans that Iran was planning a major military strike on the kingdom. This was in November. And the Americans had said they are going to intervene on behalf of their allies, etc. And this is completely different from what has been so far projected in the region. Okay. I see this as a very serious setback for American diplomacy in West Asia and a significant triumph for China.
Right. Ambassador Singh, the two gentlemen who met in Beijing, and Wang Yi, China's senior-most diplomat, very powerful member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. And if you see the photos, you will see that on the one hand, there is the National Security Council chairman of Iran. His name is Ali Shamkhani, and the Minister of State and the National Security Council Security Advisor of Saudi Arabia, Musad bin Mohammed Al-Laiban. Now, this photo op, what does it say to you? We'll come to the India question later, but your first comments on this path-breaking meeting between a Sunni state and a Shia state.
Look, this is not new. Even at the time, this is before the US intervention in Iraq in 2003, the then Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was reaching out, before 2001, was reaching out to Iran. This was Crown Prince Abdullah's basic thinking, that they had to create bridges. But I think what is more significant is the statement which was issued by Saudi Arabia yesterday, and they're calling it a trilateral. So it's not a Chinese facilitation. It was a Chinese three-way meeting in which the two other countries were involved. They're also thanking Oman. They're thanking Iraq, which is where meetings were also held. So you are seeing a new realignment taking place in the Gulf, and that should be of concern to India. Because you know the much backslapping with Jaishankar was doing just a few days ago with his I2U2. You know, India, Israel, much was made during the Raisina dialogue of this great combination of India, Israel, UAE, and US. Now that this is an arrow at the heart of that meeting, because now UAE is completely isolated, because the ones who have a problem with Iran directly is UAE, because there are 3 islands which they claim were their islands, which the Iranians have occupied. And right. They are kind of rubbing against Iran, which Saudi Arabia is not. And therefore, it is also a signal which we had been seeing signs for some time that UAE and Saudi Arabia had started parting ways. The two Mohammeds, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and now the ruler of and the president of UAE, they were very, very close at one stage. But once UAE withdrew their troops from Yemen, and then they've been acting separately to get hold of a location where they have a separate port near the Red Sea. I think the Saudi and the UAE interests have been diverging. So this is where the so-called Abrahamic Accords come in, which India has made much of. And I think what's happening is that because of the again assumption of power by Netanyahu,
Yeah.
and of a much more extreme right-wing government in Israel,
Mhm.
which of course India is quite happy to ignore because BJP is very okay with it. They are
Okay.
not uncomfortable with it. But
Right.
that is causing problems because Saudis are not comfortable with that.
Okay.
Much of the Sunni world may not be comfortable with that. So you are seeing new fissures in the Gulf and the West Asian context, which India will now find it very difficult to bridge.
So I'm going to come to the Israel question in a bit, but Ambassador Ahmad, two questions for you. You earlier talked about this, and Ambassador K.C. Singh also mentioned this realignment that's happening in the heart of the Gulf and the Middle East. Why is this so significant? Is it because Saudi Arabia is a holy custodian of the two mosques, a predominantly Sunni state, and Iran is predominantly a Shia nation? So is this coming together of the Shia-Sunni sects of Islam? Is this significant, or how significant is it?
I don't attach any significance to this so-called sectarian divide. The sectarian divide was constructed artificially, primarily by Saudi Arabia to mobilize support, domestic and regional, in terms of the security threat it perceived from Iran. But that is not the significant. It was a security threat. It had a certain strategic value. What we have to see is that in West Asia, there has been a churn in the region. Not from, it has been going on for a few years. As American credibility declined and American interest in the region diminished, the countries of the region realized that they have to safeguard their own interests on the basis of their own initiatives. These initiatives have been happening for several years. Do recall here that Saudi Arabia and Iran have had 5 rounds of dialogue in Baghdad and Oman earlier, and that has been happening. They made a degree of progress in 2021-22, and then there was a brief halt because the Iraqi government changed and they could not pick it up. As far as Turkey is concerned, they have reached out to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt, and there is a degree of engagement already taking place. So there has been a diplomatic churn in the region already taking place. What has been signaling? The countries have signaled that they have come of age. They will now pursue their own interests on the basis of their own initiatives, and that the Americans will not be involved. All the points that I have made to you have actually occurred without any American involvement. The Americans have brought it upon themselves.
So does this mean a diminishing influence of the US in this part of the world?
Absolutely. But you see, this was signaled by the Americans. It is the Americans who told us all those years ago, at the time of Obama and Hillary and Clinton, that they want to disengage from the region and pivot to Asia. Then when we had in the run-up to the elections of President Biden, he said the same thing, that he wants to diminish American involvement and there will be no military guarantees given as far as the region is concerned. So what is the region supposed to do? Simultaneously, as the Americans signaled their disengagement and disinterest, I may add, the region itself started losing any sense of credibility as far as the American role was concerned. Look at what they did in Afghanistan. The region saw with horror the Americans packing up and running away. I mean, helter-skelter. You remember that aircraft that took off from Kabul? They abandoned Kabul. They abandoned the country. How are they going to guarantee the security of these Gulf countries? So the American credibility was already at a very low ebb.
Right. Ambassador Singh, you mentioned the Abraham Accords as well as the I2U2, which India has made much of. And External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has been very much part of these conversations. Now, this realignment of forces in the Gulf region, the question to you is, how is this going to impact India?
Now, before we come to that, let me mention that I don't think US, Saudi Arabians have broken away from US, because one of the conditions they just mentioned a few days ago before this announcement, they're willing to go along, even engage Israel. But there were two conditions. One was they have a civil nuclear program, which they probably thought would never be sanctioned by the Americans, or the Israelis will veto that. And the second was that Americans give them a security guarantee. So essentially, they put that on the table before they started engaging. They went through China and tried engaging Iran. But in the background, don't forget, there is also the Ukraine war, because Iran is now becoming progressively a supplier of not only drones, but other weapons and so on and so forth. There have been news reports that new Russian planes, jet fighters, have been sighted in Iran. So their strategic reconvergence is Russia, China, Iran. And the Saudis are somewhere trying to bridge both the divides. But UAE, I find, isolated in all this, because Israel is still not able to break through to the rest of the country, certainly not with Netanyahu as the president, as the prime minister. So if the Americans thought that they can use this Abraham Accords to create a new security order in the Gulf, that has failed. That's not going to work, because Saudis will not accept it. Many other countries will not accept it. So the Saudis are balancing. They haven't left one to go to the other. They are balancing, as India is balancing between different groups. We also balancing between China and Russia on one side, and the Americans on the other. So this is Saudi balancing, and Saudis realize that progressive Americans don't need their oil. Americans are importing hardly any oil from Saudi Arabia. They are self-sufficient as far as energy is concerned, and hence their interest is shifted. So the Saudis need the markets. And where are the markets? India and China. The markets are in Asia. And I think this is part of an economic thing. But the interesting thing is Iran. Because where does it leave really the rest of the policy? Because Americans are still sanctioning Iran.
Right.
So that is where a divergence comes in. And the Iranians are beginning to supply even more deadly weapons. They might even start giving missiles to the Russians, as the Russians are running low. So we are seeing the beginning of a realignment.
Okay.
How the Americans respond to it remains to be seen.
Ambassador Ahmad, John Kirby, who is the spokesperson of the Pentagon, has said that the Saudis have been in touch with the US about these conversations with Iran, so they're not completely surprised about what's going on. So isn't this running counter to your argument that America's role or influence is diminishing in this part of the world? And second of all, what does this do to Iran? Is Iran breaking out of its isolation, especially since the sanctions were slapped on it by the Americans some years ago?
You put two questions and I'll respond to them. I have not suggested that Saudi Arabia shifted from one alignment to another. I have said that they have come of age, which means they are pursuing what we in India call strategic autonomy. They want to take decisions on their own in terms of their interests. Okay. They want to engage with everybody. For example, as far as Americans are concerned, they will continue to buy weapons. But the kind of total support Saudi Arabia used to give to American policies in the region, I think that has been reviewed. They will pursue their own interests on that basis. As far as keeping the Americans informed, it's neither here nor there. The gentleman from the Council of Security and International Studies, John Alterman, has said that the Americans were not kept informed. It's neither here nor there. Most of the writing coming from the United States says that the Americans were totally excluded from this.
Okay.
So I don't see, there has been a run-up. These 5 days, nobody knew these 5 days. These people are sitting there together, talking seriously. This is a mediation, by the way. It's not good offices alone. It seems like what the Chinese have called quasi-mediation, a degree of course, encountered with each other, talked to each other.
Why are the Chinese doing this?
Very robust support.
But why are the Chinese doing this?
Oh, China has very high stakes in regional stability. The criticisms that we used to make is that the Chinese have such high stakes in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, energy, trade, projects, investments, and technology cooperation. They have all this, but they are not engaged politically. The Chinese were hesitant. The kind of diplomacy they have now shaped as far as West Asia is concerned is not to be hands-off, to be engaged in order to promote dialogue among its principal partners who are estranged from each other. Therefore, the principal countries, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, are part of this nexus. I believe that this is something, it has been in the offing for some time. Chinese scholars have been talking about it in the past as well, that they have been encouraging their government that you should be more engaged with the region. So what the Chinese have done is that they will not push their strategic or security interests just yet, but theirs will be a benign presence promoting harmony among countries rather than asserting their own interests. I think this is what has happened just now in Beijing.
Okay. Ambassador Casey Singh, two questions to you. The first is the Iran question. Do you think that this enables Iran to break out of its isolation, especially since the Americans slapped sanctions on them several years ago? And the second is the China question. What does this do to China? Does it become a much more powerful player than it has been already? You referred to the Ukraine crisis, but first the Iran question, if I may.
No, Iranians have been very, very close to the Chinese from the time that we stepped back when we voted at the IAEA against them. So even the oil fields and all which had been promised to us, so we had a foot in the door, those were taken away and given to China. So Chinese have benefited from the sanctions.
You got Chabahar, Ambassador.
No, Chabahar, you didn't get control over it. All you got is they've given you a couple of berths there. So Iranians will always just let you come only partly into their system. You're not having any economic zone which you control in Chabahar, which is what I used to object to when it was my time. I said, fine, you want us to invest in Chabahar, but a port is nothing unless you have an economic zone with it. The Iranians do not give you any presence on the ground. They let you use a couple of berths, but they've also invited the Chinese. So that has been overplayed in India. Chabahar is not an exclusive Indian playground. The Chinese have been there, and the Iranians made no bones about it. So therefore, the Iranians are the past masters of playing one against the other, of very cunning diplomacy. Now, I don't think they break out of their isolation. They're already in the Chinese corner. They have no option but to be dealing with the Chinese, and they're not going to start major trading with GCC. Or really, Saudi Arabia, what does Saudi Arabia export? Oil, which is what Iranians don't need. So what the Iranian needs are jobs. The women are upset. The agitation is again starting. Now, those are not issues that bother either China or Saudi Arabia, but those issues are not going to go away. So what they need is technology. What they need is Western presence. What their people want is access to the West and new technologies and investment coming in manufacturing and jobs being created. Now, Chinese aren't going to come and create jobs there. Where have they created jobs? In which country? They suck the jobs out of a country. They need essentially raw material suppliers. And even Saudis cannot do, if they're going to a post-oil economy, they cannot do without the West. That's also a reason they're reaching out to India. That's also a reason that I2U2 came in, because UAE thinks it's Israeli technology, Indian workers, and they will benefit by that. So it's a realignment, but it's never a complete realignment. The Americans will take countermeasures. And let's see how far it goes, because Iranians are not easy customers to deal with. I used to always say that they are very quick at signing memorandums of understanding, but normally they are memorandums of misunderstanding, because the small print is always there. So they'll always say, but we didn't mean this, we meant that. So Iranians very quickly will sign these joint statements and so on and so forth. But they are the past masters for independent action, independent thinking, and they are not going to change the way they are internally until the revolutionary government stays. And they are going to change their behavior, and they're moving fast towards maybe nuclear weaponization. They haven't rolled back anything. Right. If anything, the enrichment has gone up further, and that is of concern to Saudi. Now, just because the Chinese are in it, the question to be asked is, can the Chinese stop the Iranians from going towards a nuclear weapon, which is what the Saudis fear? I don't think so. Iranians are not going to listen to anyone, including the Chinese, when it comes to their strategic interests. So it's interesting. What's been put in the public space is interesting, but it'll cause more jostling, more competition, and therefore complicates India's very simplistic thinking on the Gulf. You hug one leader, you hug another leader, and you think, you got new friends and you've changed alliances. No. With them, they're very, very mindful of this, of their strategic interests. And the smaller the nation, UAE, is at one stage they were calling them the Sparta of the Gulf, and nothing of the kind. It's still a very small country. It may have a lot of wealth, and they've realized they were overstepped in overstretched in Yemen, and that's why they pulled back from there.
So let me
So
ask you
there-
both, yeah, I just sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt you, Ambassador KC Singh, but I want to
Yeah.
ask you both the follow-up question on India. Ambassador Ahmad, the Iranian foreign minister recently refused to come to India. He cancelled his visit because of a 2-second clip that was part of a promo that the Observer Research Foundation, a think tank in New Delhi, which in partnership with the Ministry of External Affairs had this huge flagship event, which we all know about, the Raisina Dialogue. But in this promo, which juxtaposed a picture of the Iranian president with women in Iran protesting the regime, cutting their hair. We all know about these protests that have been taking place for several months. Now, do you think that the ORF, which refused to take out the promo, do you think they should have taken it out? How do you think this is going to impact India-Iran relations? And how would you connect this with this ferment, with this bigger picture that's evolving in the Gulf?
One important aspect of diplomacy is to know what are the interests and priorities of others. That is the whole stuff. If you are completely self-centered and think only of yourself, then you're not going anywhere. Every country has its own set of sensitivities. Would we have attended any conference where the promo clip had something about Kashmir stone throwing or something about the post-Godra riots, even a clip of a few seconds? Our leaders would not have attended that conference. So it's very clear. It was done deliberately in order to convey a message to the Iranians. It showed a total absence of sensitivity to the Iranians, and I think it was a mistake. Be that as it may, it's not for me to judge. There is a very prominent think tank in our country which conducts a certain dialogue. They are free to do what they wish. The Iranians took a principled position and they did not attend.
But they took,
India
see, the
has
think tank
had
also, but again, sorry to interrupt, but think tank also stood up for women's rights, for women's issues. This is not an ordinary thing. The women of Iran are standing up.
If you want to
their own
safeguard,
regime.
if you want to show women's issues, there are numerous clips available all over the world. So but I have said it's not about ORF. I'm talking about Iran. Countries have their own sensitivities. And if you want to engage with them, then you should be aware of what agitates them and what is of concern to them. But I think that is not significant. The main point is India has consistently subordinated its ties with Iran to other considerations, overwhelmingly American considerations. If you remember in 2003, we had a strategic partnership agreement with Iran, and we had the offer of Chabahar to us at that time. We also had a very significant defense cooperation agreement with the Iranians, intelligence cooperation agreement. All of that was nullified within 1 year when we had a change of government that prioritized the nuclear agreement, civilian nuclear agreement program with the Americans. Since then, consistently, during the period of Donald Trump, once again, we accepted all the sanctions that had been initiated by the Americans. By the most discredited regime in the United States, we accept all their sanctions on the Iranians, and we actually sacrifice our own strategic interest, crucial strategic interest of a neighboring country.
Do you
Therefore,
agree?
I am very skeptical about this kind of relationship. It's a relationship that promises a lot, achieves almost nothing on the ground. So
Ambassador
this is a
KC
part of a pattern.
Ambassador KC Singh, do you think this would have affected India-Iran relations? And do you agree with that, with this assessment?
No, that's correct. Talmiz is right. Let me also remind you that what about the BBC documentary? If we were so upset with the British just because the BBC documentary came, so Iranians would be equally upset. We have to show the same sensitivity. But when it comes to the critical matters, we have made a choice. And the choice was that you wanted to engage the Americans because the nuclear deal was not just about the nuclear deal. It was about enabling India to escape the 4 regimes which were denying technology to India. So when you're choosing between one and the other, and there was a principle involved. Because the Iranians used to say, I remember, that look, you're giving India an out and you're coming after us. But what they ignored was that we were not signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
That's right.
Iran was a signatory to the treaty. And therefore, there were consequences which come from that. And they can't compare their case to India's case. So
Okay.
there was a gap there. And I think the Iranians were unwilling to understand that. So that those differences were inevitable, because choosing between engaging Iran and getting access to technologies and becoming a member of NSG and also escaping MTCR, Wassenaar Agreement, and the 4 agreements which deny you all kinds of cutting edge technologies.
Right.
Obviously, the choice was obvious, that you would rather go the way where you can benefit the country more. So this, beyond a stage, it becomes difficult. But what is interesting with Saudi Arabia and Iran and this new alignment is the Chinese are trying to bridge it. But this bridging will only occur up to a point. Then the differences, innate differences between regime in Tehran and the Saudis and their clash of the interests in multiple friction points, they can't be bridged. Beyond a stage, it can't be bridged. And the Chinese will see up to what extent they can play the role. Because if Americans, by committing forces, by having their soldiers there, by coming into Kuwait and getting it vacated of Saddam Hussein, if still they are not able to find a toehold, Chinese simply by holding a meeting, getting 2 people to hold hands together and saying, we'll buy your oil, you're both good guys, so why are you fighting with each other? I think this will only last for a while. Beyond that, basic strategic interests will take over.
Right. Last question to you, Ambassador Ahmad. Do you agree with this assessment that the Chinese are, while they're trying to expand their influence in the Gulf, may not be able to supplant the Americans?
There is no question of supplanting the Americans. Look at the American presence. The American presence, they are located physically in terms of their armed forces in every country of the region. Except for Iran, and they are there in Syria and in Iraq as well. They have extraordinary military facilities.
Right.
They're all across the Indian Ocean. They are able to militarily intervene wherever American interests are involved. There's no question. I want you to listen carefully to what the Chinese are saying. Nobody can supplant the Americans. No other country, and nobody is saying that I'm cutting ties. By the way, if the Americans were to reach out to Iran and engage with Iran, you would find Iran equally responsive. If you are saying it is the American blind, they are completely blind to their strategic interests, largely because of the Israel lobby and the domestic pressures. So let us be very clear: nobody is seeking to supplant. What the Chinese say is that we have certain crucial interests in the region. They relate to the Belt and Road, our economic cooperation, energy cooperation, investment, technology, etc. They also recognize that they cannot solve problems. Problems can only be solved bilaterally between the countries concerned. What they want to do is to manage complex relationships so that they don't get out of hand and they result in conflict. That is what their approach is. Management of relations. This is the message that has come out. I think this is a crucial development. The fact that Saudi Arabia and Iran can engage with each other, actually sign an agreement with each other, re-establish diplomatic relations, commit each other to respecting sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs, all of this will have a certain positive impact in the regional security scenario. Let's be very objective about it. Chinese have therefore delivered somewhere. The Americans can't deliver because they are partisan. They are blindsided by their domestic pressure. They have no consistency with regard to policy. With regard to the nuclear agreement, one president goes along with the nuclear agreement, and the other president comes within 1 year, he's already rescinded it. They have no credibility as a result.
Okay. Ambassador K.C. Singh, you have the last word. Why do you think India was not able to broker an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia? I hope that doesn't sound too simplistic, but if India has had age-old ties with both these nations, why didn't it do what the Chinese have done?
Well, we don't have the market the size of China, and secondly, it doesn't help. I think we understand the region better than the Chinese do. They don't understand the role of religion. We have Shias and we have Sunnis in a country. It has domestic implications for us. When you take positions here, when there was the Iran-Iraq war, we dealt with both. I don't think we reached a level of military and economic strength where we try molding the external environment. It's very difficult. And we don't like other people to mold our environment. When they give us advice on Kashmir, we tell them to keep it to themselves. So, basically, we don't like to poke our nose in other people's affairs because it doesn't work. We've seen it hasn't worked for the Americans. It doesn't work. It's not worked for the Russians. Wherever they have intervened, they're stuck in Syria. But what have they really achieved there? They've saved Assad. But beyond that, that country is still not fully settled. So it's always very difficult to intervene in another country. And countries, small or big, they look to their national interests. I think it's best to keep your relationships on even.
But the Chinese are attempting what you're saying other people haven't, at least in the recent.
I think I don't think it's going to have any lasting impact. Neither Saudi Arabia nor the Iranians are going to change their behavior. Probably all that you may get is the Saudis may now deny Israeli planes access to their airspace if they want to attack Iran. That's the maximum that Iran will gain from it, which is actually not a bad thing, because Iran will have to find some other way. Because unless they are refueled somewhere over the Gulf, their planes cannot stay over Iran and attack all the facilities and go back.
Okay.
So that sort of gain can be there for Iran. But overall, Iranians are not going to change how they deal with Iraq or their Shia crescent or their interest in Hezbollah and so on and so forth. So though that competition will go, probably it'll become less brisk in certain ways. Immediate benefit maybe in Yemen, which is where I think Saudis are wanting a solution where Houthis come to some kind of terms with them. And the Iranians have shown they've been able to sustain the Houthis. So I think the benefit for Saudi Arabia may be in Yemen, that they are able to de-escalate there, which will be quite a gain for them.
Okay, so I think we're completely out of time, but this has been a really fascinating discussion with both of you, Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad and Ambassador K.C. Singh. Thank you both so much for your time. This is a fascinating development and we will be watching the space. But thank you so much for joining me on the Print Debates.
Thank you very much.